Okay, so hello everybody. We're here again with a recording for Men's Health Week. It's really joyful for me personally to be here today with Efrain and Michael. Guys, would you like to introduce yourselves to start with? Efrain, perhaps you'd like to go first?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me, Lynn. So hi, I'm Efrain. I'm the Global Director of Creative Effectiveness and Diversity and Inclusion at Reckitt. And I'm a Chicagoan based in London, if you're trying to place my accent and where I'm at.
Michael?
Hi there. Hi, I'm Michael Brown. I work at Universal McCann, which is a media agency that's part of IPG. And we're also very proud members of the Unstereotype Alliance, which I mentioned just because it kind of shapes some of my personal feelings towards some of the things we'll be talking about.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michael. So it's Men's Health Week. I wanted to start by just asking, how are you both feeling today out of 10?
Do you want to go, Efrain?
Sure. Yeah. No, I'm feeling good. We admittedly are recording on a Friday, so I will have to acknowledge there is a bit of an influence of the day we are on, but I'm feeling pretty good. The sun's out. It's Health Week, Men's Health Week, and I think that's a really great thing to be walking into next week. So I'm in good spirits right now.
Great.
Echoing that myself. Yeah, feeling good. Out of 10, probably 7. Also happy about the slightly brighter skies and lack of rain. I've got a nice relaxed weekend and a table booked at my favorite restaurant tomorrow evening, so I'm feeling good about that.
Very nice. That sounds great. That sounds great. So Efrain, Reckitt is a business focused on hygiene, health and nutrition. So I wondered what steps the business has taken to actively support men's health through brands and through advertising that you create. And I wondered what you've learned works really well and perhaps what doesn't work so well when it comes to engaging men and boys effectively.
Yeah, it's a really great question and something that's really critical for a handful of our brands. I think I'll maybe talk about specific ones, and I might start in a bit of an odd place, actually. If I look at the work that our Nurofen business is doing around See My Pain, which is about the gender pain gap, which is actually targeted towards women because they disproportionately are dismissed in terms of their pain being diagnosed. But men also face that challenge. And what was a bit of an interesting result of some of the early work we did on See My Pain is we actually saw the pain gap reduce for men as well as an interesting outcome, maybe unintended, but because, long story long, to get a bit to your question is like what works well is when you think about the fundamentals that might be getting in the way of anyone and provide that right support. So for example, Nurofen really has been just trying to provide support on how to better the communication between a patient and a healthcare practitioner. And that work is relevant for men, women, and people who identify in ways outside of those two binaries. So it's an interesting thing to really think about what are the barriers, and the barriers are often affecting more than one group. So really thinking that way, but then also a brand like Durex, which is also in the Reckitt portfolio, really has a responsibility to thinking about men and men's health. We make condoms, right? So that is specifically, relevant for people with penises, and thinking about health in terms of STI, STD, sexual well-being, which goes beyond that, the mental talk track you tell yourself. A more confident person is going to be making more healthy sexual decisions, and that's really important and part of how Durex comes to market.
Yeah, brilliant. I mean, sexual wellness is such a core part of our well-being, isn't it, and our health. I think it's so important to tackle those topics and equip people with knowledge to be able to enjoy that side of their life in a way that's really healthy. So Michael, what about you? At what are the considerations around channel choice? Because of course it's not just how brands communicate, but where they show up. That also has an impact.
I mean, honestly, Lynn, I think it's very easy to lay the blame at the door of social media and digital, and it often is. I do think that the content has more of an influence on some of the toxic dynamics around masculine behavior that exist. Obviously we've seen a huge increase in people fanatically following people like Andrew Tate, which is really concerning. And obviously that's really mainly propagated by the video streaming platforms. So yeah, certainly I think social media has a part to play in all of this. It's interesting, we do quite a lot of work with Campaign Against Living Miserably at and through that relationship we've come to learn quite a lot about the suicide crisis in the UK. The fastest rising suicide rate is amongst young girls aged 16 to 24, young girls and women, and the analysis shows that social media has a big part to play in that. Specifically, the pressure to look a certain way, being focused in all of the time on other people's lives, what other people are doing, how they look, and that kind of thing. And so I do think that social media has a part to play, but thinking about which media and which channels we can channel and harness in order to make more of a positive difference, I think we still have to focus on where are the eyeballs, where are people, what media are people consuming? And that is prevailingly digital, social media and TV. And so I think working within those channels to put more progressive narratives about gender and masculinity out into society feels like a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree. People are ending up in the manosphere because there's a gap, there's a lack of content to fill that need and answer those questions. So I suppose, there's an opportunity for brands and organizations to fill that and show up with empathy and show how, a different way to answer those questions that's more positive. So, personally, I think all brands can play a role when it comes to men's health. Reckitt's in a great position, Efrain. You've got direct channels and relevance, but I think all brands can have a positive impact. Would you agree? And how do you think brands can contribute to men's health, men's well-being?
I agree that all brands, all communications have the opportunity, the ability, the responsibility to do something. Advertising shapes culture. A lot of us got into Adland because of that. And so if we hold that as a truth, then we also need to hold the other side of it, in that there's a responsibility for us to hopefully shape that into a more positive way. And I'll give you a great example of how some of the other brands in our portfolio at Reckitt are also thinking about how we portray men. We have a wide portfolio of brands that are used in the home and help make home living cleaner, safer, healthier. And so if I were to pick one of our hygiene brands like Finish dishwashing detergent, they also have a responsibility in creating a version of the world, or portraying a version of the world where men aren't just prescribed to behave a certain way, and women. And the trope that I really try to bring a lot of awareness in terms of our hygiene teams is the doofus dad. Oh, dad can't take care of the baby, and dad's a slob and makes a mess. That's harmful to both men and women. It puts women in the role of having to be responsible for unpaid domestic labor. And even in developed markets, women are doing more unpaid domestic labor than men, keeping them from social mobility, right? And we also know that, it hurts men because not all men are slobs, don't know how to take care of a child. There's very competent fathers out there, and we have a responsibility to portray them in our stories in the home just as much. And so even a brand that is maybe a home cleaner can have a positive influence on how men are portrayed outside the direct channels, like being a healthcare brand or working in healthcare. So I to answer your question, yes, I think all brands have a role here.
Yeah, I love that, Efrain. Paloma Faith was on BBC Radio 2 this morning as I was coming back from the school run, and she's written a book about, her lived experience and the challenges of living up to perfection and the weight of being a mum. And being a famous person on top of all that, and how she just can't achieve it. But we make things better when, as you say, there are many, many capable fathers and dads, and sharing that load and sharing how we perceive that is really key. What are your thoughts, Michael?
So yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think all brands, obviously some brands like lifestyle brands, fashion brands, feel like they've got a more natural into making social statements. We ran some research with Calm a couple of years ago, a piece that we called The Mandate. It was a kind of thought leadership project about masculine representation. And yeah, not to get too numbersy, but I've written down just a couple of stats. So we captured that 67% of UK men feel that brands have got a part to play in shaping masculine behaviors, like norms. And that was even higher amongst younger men. So it feels like younger men are particularly susceptible to those narratives that are put out there, for better and for worse. Incidentally, we captured through the research a kind of list of what the most prevailing and common stereotypes were that exist. And they tended to be the most common ones. I mentioned that, I highlight that just because they're not the most offensive ones. The most common ones were strong, macho, sporty, confident, dumb, rich, drinking, laddie. I guess like those types of tropes tended to be the most common. But what we found is that some of them were more offensive than others. So first of all, we asked, how do you recognize these around you? And then we asked, how offensive are these? And when we ranked them, the most offensive ones were rude to women, loud and aggressive. So it feels like that is that sits particularly badly with UK men, which is obviously reassuring. But yeah, a few final stats. Not to go down too much of a rabbit hole, but we also used the survey to drill down into certain groups within our male sample. So multi-ethnic men, a kind of imperfectly grouped group. Obviously, ideally, you break out by specific ethnicity, but for lack of sample, we grouped them. Angry, poor, uneducated, rude, ghetto tended to over-index massively amongst Black, Asian, and multi-ethnic respondents. And amongst queer men, the stereotypes of perverted, camp, bitchy, forgive the word, I hate that word, and sexually unhealthy were the most common ones. So I share those stats just to paint a picture of just the many different tropes that exist out there. And actually, when you drill down by specific communities, it can really vary according to what kind of masculinity we identify with, which stereotypes tend to be attached to us.
Yeah, it's really, really powerful. Thank you for sharing that. And you touched on this already, Efrain. This is about smashing stereotypes, isn't it? So to evolve things and make them better, that's what we need to do. So that there's a way to go. How do you think advertising needs to evolve? You know, beyond that broad brushstroke of smashing stereotypes, what needs to happen to make things better in terms of how we see men and boys portrayed in advertising?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question that I'm not sure anyone has the answer to. So I'll give you my point of view, of course, but part of the problem in terms of how I see it is that masculinity is so entangled with identity when it doesn't need to be. Like, I can be a kind person. That can be my identity. Like, why all of us, like, why are we hyper focused on like masculinity being the identity, whether it be healthy or toxic? Like, masculinity feels like a choice to be the key adjective you put in front of your identity. And I think that might be a worthy conversation, is like, we really need to unpick the requirement of masculinity to be a core element of identity for individuals, and better portray the versions of masculinity that are positive but are multidimensional. I think, for example, there tend to be visual cues that immediately are associated with language like toxic masculinity. If I pick one like smoking or cigars, like, oh, that's associated with like toxic masculine people. It's like, no, it's like, it doesn't need to be. It's like a hobby. It's a habit. It's something that someone might enjoy that could also be very, have healthy masculinity. But we've kind of lost our way a little bit in the discourse, where I really think we need to unpick masculinity as a defining characteristic of identity.
Yeah. I mean, it's, as you were saying, why do we view the world through that binary lens when actually what we are is people? And that's what people love to see, is, you know, authentic, really interesting, rich portrayals of people. What are your thoughts, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, on what in particular, Lynn? Forgive me. Just on.
Well, just in terms of, you know, what needs to change for portrayals of men to
Oh, yeah.
become more positive.
Yeah, I think what needs to change is just to have a much more creative approach towards representation, and also probably to have more. It almost feels cliche at this stage to still be saying it, but to have a more diverse group of people around the table when campaigns are being created. You know, the IPA census has shown that there's not been an awful lot of progress in terms of who's working within the agency community. There's definitely some signals of progress around ethnicity, but, you know, I think we just need to have a much kind of bigger picture approach towards male representation, and actually the representation, it obviously goes in hand with all types of representation, doesn't it? That
Yes.
we can be rather simplistic in the way that we approach creative.
Yes, yeah, and you know, there's massive power in seeing yourself seen authentically, isn't there, in advertising and in the media. So when I was talking at Adweek Europe recently, I got chatting to this lady. We got chatting about representation, and she said, you know, you won't see it from how I look, but I'm of a Chinese background. And when I was growing up, I never saw anybody who looked like me on the TV. I never saw anybody in an ad who looked like me. And so I just felt I didn't have anybody I could connect with or relate to. And then when she started to see people like her, they were stereotyped. So, you know, in EastEnders on the market stall, selling CDs. So when she finally saw herself in a TV series as a teenager, she actually cried. So I think if that's not your lived experience, it's hard to relate to just how important and how powerful it is. So I wondered, you know, do both of you feel seen in advertising or in the media?
What do you think, Efrain?
Parts of me, I'm a white man, so I see myself all over the place. I'm also a white gay man, and I see certain versions of white gay men portrayed all over the place. Maybe not all over the place, but in places. When it comes to the additional layers of my identity, gay Puerto Rican man, I've seen a few portrayals that have really stuck out to me. John Leguizamo playing Chi-Chi in Tu Wong Fu, Thank You for Everything, Julie Newmar, or someone like Walter Mercado, which I watched growing up on the news, giving fortunes to so many millions of people in Latin America and the Spanish-speaking US community. But I would argue we tend to see specific either storylines of those identities, or if we broaden it out to a broader LGBTQ plus community, I only see one small fraction of that broader family I'm a part of. Where are my trans family members in representation? They're nowhere. Where are my disabled, you know, brothers and sisters that are in the queer community? I don't see them either. So I would say, to answer, parts of me I see, and because I identify as a white man, I see that part of me all over the place. But the other parts, the more nuanced parts, I don't get to see as often.
Yeah,
completely agree with that. I think, you know, it's interesting. John Lewis last Christmas chose to show a single parent family, a kind of unconventional, untraditional family structure in their campaign, and they got lots of hatred. I don't know exactly how much, because it's easy to overstate, isn't it, when people start kicking off on Twitter. Perhaps it was a vocal minority, but in any case, there were some grumbling people that were saying, why does John Lewis have to insist on breaking tradition and that kind of thing? And actually, you know, for me, it just felt amazing, because I grew up with my dad in a single father family. And so I love seeing single parent families and unconventional family structures that obviously statistically are very common in society. It's interesting, Efrain. I'm half Colombian, so we've got decent Latino representation on the call, and but I present very much as a white middle class British person, and it took me a really long time to connect to that Colombian identity, because during the 90s, I guess when I was a kid, you know, the stereotypes that existed of Colombian identity were very violent, around the narco wars and that kind of thing, and it felt incredibly lonely to not be able to share that part of my culture with anybody. And what feels amazing now is that yes, Narcos and the sensationalist like Griseldas of this world continue to be produced, and there's a big market for them. But there are so many different, more positive examples of Colombian representation through music, reggaeton, people who actually go to Colombia and have incredible holiday experiences. And so I think for me, I just think about that almost as a metaphor for, identity going from something that was so private. I couldn't speak to hardly anybody. No one knew what Colombia really was as an experience or what there was there other than drugs and violence, to now, which is, something that's so much more positive. And I think, we do see more examples of queer representation, don't we? And largely thanks to Channel 4. I think if it weren't for their intervention, I don't think there would be such energy around producing more diverse work. So I really credit them for having done that, because it's a real honor, isn't it, to be the brand that scoops the Diversity in Advertising Award each year. But like you say, Efrain, I think there's many more frontiers that we need to make progress around, especially around LGBTQ plus things like disability, socioeconomics. I think largely you just see so many middle class experiences represented in creative, whereas lower socioeconomic groups must feel incredibly estranged from the creative that they see on the telly, for example. Homes with like big gardens, for example, when for many people obviously that's completely unrealistic.
I remember in a previous conversation, Efrain, we were talking about how, we're like recipes. So, identity is intersectional, and we've got lots of different ingredients that make us up, but that's what makes us all unique and interesting. And that's what people engage with, are interesting stories and interesting personalities, but positive ones. So yeah, I think seeing that variety is so important, and celebrating.
I think there's a statistic that I throw around a lot when I talk to teams around representation and how important that is. And it comes from I think a 2021 Kantar Global Monitor study. So I think there's actually a more recent data point that I should be throwing around. But the one that's in my mind, I believe is from 21, is around 80 or 88%, I can't remember specifically, of people don't see themselves in advertising. And that tends to be the thing that we talk about most. But within that is they also don't see the people around them. Because I feel like marketeers often find it's an all or nothing game in terms of representing people, but it's you can still resonate with someone because you're portraying a story that is featuring people that they know in their lives. And that is also a way to engage. And I think we sometimes lose sight about that aspect, and it's more focused on the individual representation of an individual or a specific group, but people have such diverse circles around them. And if the advertising industry doesn't show that in reality, it feels really disconnected to their lives. And we saw that in that Global Monitor research.
Yes. Yeah. You're missing a trick by not doing that.
I'd also say that, just on your point then about identities, I think it's easy to assume that the most formative, influential identities, characteristics that people have, are the ones that are most visible, be it their ethnicity or whatever, their gender, how they present. But actually, for me personally, I would say that, as well as queerness, it is things like being raised by a single dad, or, bereavement, for example, having lost my mum. Those things they don't fit into the conventional spectrum of identities, but they've been some of the most formative things that have happened to me and that have shaped who I am. Which I think often gets missed because we're very keen to categorize each other, aren't we? That's a woman, this is a man, they're tall, they're not, that kind of thing.
Yeah, they're kind of definable or visible characteristics, aren't they? But often what makes us really interesting in people are the stories and the lives that we've lived. And so it's telling those stories that I think is really super powerful. And that's what people engage with, emotion, and we're interested in people and in each other. So thinking specifically about health again, during the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of health related stigma associated with being gay or bisexual due to, the HIV and AIDS problem. Do you think there's still a hangover from that today? And I wondered, are there other specific health related issues that gay men face that brands and businesses need to focus on?
I would say, as someone who is a gay man like stigma still exists around HIV and AIDS. There's still parts of the community who think that people who have HIV and AIDS can't be dated or are not worthy for whatever reason. So there's still some stigma. And when we think about what brands can do around men's health issues, current men's health issues, we talked a bit about mental health being one. And we also talked about how, providing stories that enable a broader set of people who identify as men to be seen and seen in a positive way contributes to feeling welcome. And I think there's been lots of headlines and research around a loneliness epidemic that men are facing, but lots of communities are actually facing, even within the LGBTQ plus community. And so I think by opening and broadening definitions of positive personhood, not just through the lens of masculinity, are things that brands can do. Just within Reckitt, we're reaching billions of people in a year. If all of the brands who are sending out all of those messages are really consciously thinking about this and making that effort, well, that's going to really have an impact. I said earlier, like, advertising does influence culture. We have the power to do that. We see it happen time and time again from this industry. So, I think there is something that can be done. And just by starting with thinking about the stories you tell and how you tell that stories is a good first step to take.
I think also packaging comes to mind as well. I think there's a cool example from Calm's World, charity I mentioned earlier. Packet of crisps sold at the pub, and you open it up as blokes are given to do when they're enjoying a pint, and people of all genders are given to do when they're enjoying a pint. Open it up, and on the inside of the packet, it's got just some questions to help open up easy conversations about mental health and that kind of thing. And I think there's an interesting role for packaging as well as creative representation as well, Lynn, just in terms of helping to drive progress.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. But I think change happens, doesn't it, when businesses make a commitment that that's what they're going to do, and they implement structures and people like both of you who champion it and make change actually happen. So it's only when we make that commitment that it becomes a reality. But beyond that, I wondered what your thoughts are on what business leaders should be doing to support the health and well-being of their gay employees. Do you have a point of view on that, Michael?
Oh yeah, loads of things come to mind, Lynn. And I'm proud to say that we're really good at this at IPG. So what would I say? I'd say appointing queer leaders and LGBTQ plus leaders is a really important one. Obviously, it just evidences to other people in the organization that they can get to senior positions and that you can have their sexuality or gender identity and still be at the top. There's quite specific things around policy and benefits, for example, like, having a policy towards trans people who choose to transition and reassign their gender, for example. That's quite a practical thing that not many companies have. Inclusive parental policies, obviously that's quite an important one. I'm really proud that a friend of mine at work recently came back from having adopted having had a kid with a surrogate mother, and very, very lovely moment in the history of our company, really, to have that precedent, and very encouraging, I guess, for me, if that's ever something that I choose to do. And also, I would say educating colleagues on how to be supportive to LGBTQ plus colleagues. I guess just like creating positivity around LGBTQ plus in the business, not just parties, but educating around specific things. At the moment, the most pressing thing is transphobia, because it is very much on fire as a problem in this country and many others, unfortunately.
Yes.
And the final point I'd mention is around mental health support, because mental health challenges and struggles over-index quite significantly amongst LGBTQ plus people. So yeah, I mean, organizations obviously ideally should have decent mental health policies and support in place, but the reality is that our communities can over-index in needing them. And so that's another great thing that companies can do in order to support LGBTQ plus people and queer men.
Yeah, brilliant. That's really useful, Michael. Thank you. So lots of practical, tangible things that people can take away and do easily to have a positive impact. So a key theme of this year's Men's Health Week is, to encourage more conversation and to talk about health related issues. I wonder who your go-to people are, and how able you feel to share those kind of things.
I mean, I'm not good at it. I've inherited, unfortunately, my dad's working class, brummy, complete reticence to go to the doctor. Even though I'm a very middle class, Kingston upon Thames raised brat, but yeah, even I struggle with getting myself to the doctor. And I wonder, and preparing for this chat, I've just been thinking that we're probably overdue a public health campaign, like the drink driving campaigns, the seatbelt campaigns. They're always heralded, the stop smoking campaigns, as best practices in terms of mass behavior change. And I think that there's a long way to go before men are really confident at going to the doctors as soon as they should be. Where does it come from? Certain fear, probably. Half of it might be fear, and then the other half might be not wanting to make a fuss. That's my hypothesis.
Yeah. And you, Efrain?
Yeah, in the US healthcare kind of context, millennial men like famously do not go to doctors because insurance and the healthcare system aside in the US, young male bodies are the paragon of health. So in their minds, why would I go? There's not a problem. And I think for me, I don't just wait for a problem. I'm always trying to be proactive with my healthcare and my mental well-being. But I'm also similar to Michael. It's like it's a bit of a challenge because I grew up not that way. So it is really kind of effort. And one thing that kind of keeps me focused is like, I'm in a loving partnership and it's not just about me. So I have to take care of myself to, be a good partner. And so that's important to me. So that means I have to maybe break some of those habits. But it's not easy. It isn't.
No.
Especially with men, we've been trained to not use care. Like care is not a trait that is often recognized, rewarded, celebrated in men. And that also, I think, is influencing how we think about self-care.
Yes. Yeah, I think, self-care and also caring for each other, that's something that's come up a lot in the other conversations I've had. And I spoke to a guy called Stamatios yesterday, and he was very open in sharing that he'd been experiencing pain in his back and a problem, but he felt he had to be strong as a dad. He had to be able to pick up his kids and carry them. He had to carry all the bags of shopping and everything. So he didn't do anything about it until he physically couldn't get out of bed. And then the consequences in his life later were that he couldn't pick up his children for some time until he'd recovered from surgery. So, I think people being really honest and sharing stories like that. So, his message was don't delay, get help, because if you do something now, as you're saying, Efrain, for your own well-being, but also for the people you love and care about, you want to be there to enjoy life.
It's a bit of a behavioural phenomenon and curiosity, really, Lynn. I just kept getting sick over and over for the first few months of this year, and it got to a place where I just thought, I need to see the doctor. I have to. I think it doesn't help that there's a kind of narrative that it's impossible to get in front of a GP, which in my experience was not the case. I managed to get in front of a GP within 12 hours, and then that same day I was at St Thomas's getting a chest x-ray and getting my bloods done. So it was an amazing experience of the NHS. But yeah, it's funny that, well, it's not at all funny. It's slightly disturbing that the doo-doo really has to hit the fan in order to get us to go to the doctor sometimes. And that's unfortunate.
And hopefully it will change. I think with more conversations like these and more self-awareness and self-care becoming important. Sometimes I think the definitions of masculinity and femininity don't help us because they're the polar opposites of each other. And that's where I think, just embracing people, as we've been talking about today, is really key.
I would say that I think role modeling is important in family context, for example. So for dads to go to the doctor really visibly with their kids, to role model that, in popular culture, perhaps the most sought after influencer, if you're trying to sell crisps or sunglasses or whatever, is Roman Kemp, and I just think he is a formidable force when it comes to change making around male mental health. He's made a documentary, which I'm sure many people listening will have seen already, and written a book actually, having lost his best friend Joe, who used to produce his breakfast show on Capital FM, and also having had his own challenges with his mental health and suicidality. And I just think a role model like that, that's having these big, expansive, brave, vulnerable conversations about mental health and suicide, that the effect of that, I think it can't be underestimated. And so I think more role models like that, that show that it's okay to look after ourselves, because whilst for me it happened to be a chest infection, actually, for somebody else, similar, a kind of parallel scenario, it could be around mental health, where you're just slowly discombobulating and breaking down like an old car, like a banger that's just slowly breaking down. Perhaps it's anxiety and then waves of depression, and then one day you just can't get out of bed. Whereas actually having a more proactive approach towards looking after our mental health, and it's often said we should treat our mental health in the same way as we treat our physical health and prioritize it in the same way. But actually, we're rubbish at prioritizing our physical health. So we just need a whole revolution around them both.
Yes, yes, yeah. More role models. I have 14-year-old son and 11-year-old son, and I definitely passionately want them to see positive male role models.
Mm.
I think it's tragic. My youngest son was doing gymnastics. He was really good at it, and his older brother said, you need to find a different sport, because if you do that, you'll get bullied at school. How can stereotypes like that still exist today? I think it's tragic.
Yeah. I mean, on the theme, one of the questions we asked in the research I was on about earlier was about role models. Who do you identify as role models in society? And the ones, so we had Roman Kemp got mentioned, David Beckham, Joe Wicks, Harry Styles, Ed Sheeran. So it's really interesting. There's a commonality there in a way, isn't there? In that they're quite proudly sentimental, and they're not really that kind of stoic and conventional machista type of a bloke. They're quite soft in a way, aren't they?
Yeah. I think there's also been some great male friendships as well, and that's important. You talked about the impact of loneliness, Efrain. I think male friendships are really important too. So like the Hairy Bikers and their relationship.
Well, yeah, because masculinity and the patriarchy defines masculinity as a competitive sport. So it's not a communal one, right? So it's my masculinity versus your masculinity, and may the alpha win. And so that's why I think masculinity needs to be detached from a defining part of identity. I'd be interesting to see in future research, like masculine women also exist. And they could also be great influencers and advocates for like what positive masculinity can look. There's also toxic masculinity that exists in very femme presenting people too, right? So it's not as clear cut, but that's why I think identity, like attaching masculinity and the traditional concepts of it to identity, get us in this quagmire.
Yeah, they do. It's so unhelpful, isn't it?
Yeah.
It is. Yeah, it's really unhelpful. So if people should take away one thing from this conversation, because we know that's the most likely, and you may well have different opinions, but if they take away one thing, what would that be? What would you want them to think, feel, and maybe do differently? Let's start with you, Michael.
So I think addressing a community of marketing folk and researchy people, I would say make space for thinking about progressive gender strategy generally, because for younger people, so like Pink News, I was with them yesterday, they've got a really interesting kind of platform name at the minute, which is that they're selling Pink News as the new majority, because amongst 16 to let's say 24, perhaps even 34-year-olds nowadays, is actually kind of 1 in 2 people that don't define as being completely straight. So actually queerness is going to be the new majority at some moment in time in the future. Younger people have got, many of them, really evolved, changed understandings of what gender can be. I hasten to emphasize that there is the undercurrent of regressive Andrew Tate worrying movement towards a more traditional and horrible form of masculinity. But when we do focus groups amongst younger people, we'll ask questions around, what do you think? What would you put into a time capsule for people to open up in 100 years' time and understand the moment that we're living in? And they'll often put in symbols of diversity or different artists or people in public life that have different diverse characteristics. So the times are changing, the tide has turned, and I would say make space to have a diverse strategy and an inclusive approach to representation. And yes, that applies to masculinity as well. I would say, just on a broader note, not just kind of, I guess, more the people, society, not B2B, B2C, I would say my call to action would be try and be more conscious of just how badly we are being served by the government around mental health support, because it's really poor. And actually, I don't think any of the parties so far have really made mental health a very prominent part of their manifestos or their pre-manifesto preludes, despite the fact that I think all of the mental health charities have been lobbying them to really make it prominent. And the fact that when a man who might be struggling mentally goes to their GP, they might get given, if they're lucky, a waiting list and then some CBT, which is very tactical. It won't really address any kind of underlying or behavioral things that psychotherapy is required for, plus medication. Nothing wrong with medication, but it's a total band-aid. And so, yeah, there has to be a complete rethink as well around the way in which mental health is given to people, and that would make a massive difference, I think, in having healthier men in society.
Agree. Thank you for that, Michael. Efrain?
One, I would say, let's try to decouple masculinity from identity. And I think to the marketeers and researchy people, is that what you said? Researchy people is the researchy people, when we're doing things as part of our day-to-day activities like pen portraits or defining recruitment briefs, like really try to challenge yourself and take a moment and say, am I over relying on a stereotype or a bias to articulate who this consumer is or the person we want to engage with? Because oftentimes it's those little small things that each of us can do that will have a huge impact collectively. And, I have D&I in my job title, but I think it's really important that we all understand we all have a responsibility to D&I in our work, not just the few of us who have it in our job titles.
Yeah, brilliant.
Wonderful. Yeah, great point, Efrain.
Well, I want to thank you so much for having this conversation today. I've really enjoyed it. I hope you have too, and I'm sure other people will find it really useful and interesting. And I also wanted to thank you both, not just for showing up and sharing your opinions, but also for all the great work you do. It's great to be out there talking about things, but change happens when people take active steps to make a difference. And you both stand out for me as people who do that day to day. So thank you as well for the difference you're making.
Thank you, Lynn. I think the same of you, actually. So it's nice to be with you in this conversation. So thank you for inviting me to it.
Thank you very much.
I completely agree. Yeah, thank you, Lynn.
Thank you.